I would like to continue the series of videos on the best games of the famous candidates tournament in Zurich. In today's game you will see how to make use of space advantage effectively. Taimanov opened a file on the queenside first and doubled his rooks on that file. However, Geller controlled all invasion squares and Taimanov's rooks couldn't invade the queenside. Therefore, using the greater mobility of his pieces, Taimanov started active play on the kingside, distracting the enemy pieces from the defense of the queenside, which eventually let Taimanov's rooks invade the queenside with great effect. Taimanov started with d4 and Geller played his favorite King's Indian defense. Bishop g7, e4, short castle, knight f3, d6, bishop e2, e5, short castle, knight d7, rook e1, c6, bishop f1 and rook e8. And now black is ready to exchange on d4, after which black pieces would get some activity. The rook's file would open and the rook would exert pressure on the e4 pawn, and the black knight on d7 will be able to jump either on c5 or on e5. That's why Taimanov prevents the exchange on d4 and advances his pawn to d5, grabbing space. Now white has the space advantage in the center, and besides that Taimanov has created an immediate threat, namely the exchange on c6, after which the d file will open and the unguarded pawn on d6 would fall. However, the advance of the pawn to d5 has its drawback too, namely when the pawn was on d4 it controls the c5 square. And now that the pawn is on d5, the black knight can jump on c5. Not immediately, of course, because knight c5 doesn't work right now, because white would simply kick it out by playing b4. That's why before playing knight c5, black must play a5 in order to prevent white from playing b4, and only then knight c5. So what to do now? Black has three options. The first one is to keep the tension in the center and play either queen c7 in order to defend the d6 pawn in case white captures on c6. Now the queen will, in this case, defend the pawn on d6. This was suggested by Taimanov himself in his annotations, or David Bronstein's recommendation. In his great book dedicated to this tournament, Bronstein recommends queen e7. Again, keeping the tension in the center, defending the pawn, after which Bronstein recommends to play a5, knight c5, followed by preparation of f5 and some active play on the king side. The second option, besides keeping the tension in the center, is to exchange on d5. And the third option is to close the center by playing c5. And that's exactly what Geller did. However, as the game will show, that wasn't the best decision. After c5, the plans of the sides are obvious. White is going to play on the queen side, of course, because white has the space advantage on the queen side and in the center. So white is going to play a3, b4, open the b file and try to invade black's queen side with his pieces. While black, of course, must play on the king side, and the most natural and effective way to start the counterplay on the king side is f5. However, Taimanov prevents f5. Before starting his active play on the queen side, Taimanov made a very deep prophylactic move, g3. This move has two ideas. The first one is to ensure the knight's position on h4. The g3 pawn will defend the knight on h4 because the queen otherwise would attack it after the f6 knight moves. Now the knight will be defended on h4, and of course the knight will control the f5 square, and black wouldn't be able to play f5 after that. And the second idea behind g3 is to open the bishop's diagonal, bishop's way to h3. And in some variations it will be very important, as you will see. In case black insists on f5 and plays rook f8, so that the rook supports the f-pawn, Taimanov gives the following variation. Queen c2, the queen now also controls the f5 square. Black must play knight e8 in order to unblock the f-pawn. And of course white will play knight h4. Now the knight also controls the f5 square. As you see, white controls the f5 square 3 times. So black cannot play f5. But if black still insists upon f5 and plays knight b6, opening the bishop's diagonal, now black again is threatening to play f5, white can simply play bishop d3. taking under control the f5 square one more time, and black simply wouldn't be able to play f5. As f5 doesn't work and rook f8 doesn't make any sense, Taimanov Geller played knight f8, opening the bishop's diagonal. Now the bishop controls the f5 square. And now Taimanov starts his play on the queenside, a3, preparing b4 of course. Geller plays knight g4. He still hopes to play f5, and at the moment f5 is possible, but of course knight h4 followed. As you see, the knight is defended, the queen cannot capture it, and black cannot play f5. In case black plays f5, Taimanov gives the following variation: e takes f, g takes f, and now you can see the second idea behind g3, which I already mentioned, bishop h3. And white creates an immediate threat. Knight takes f5, and after bishop takes f5, simply bishop takes g4, and as the queen is also attacking the g4 knight, white will simply be a pawn up. And it's not easy, actually, it's not clear how black is going to defend the f5 pawn in this variation. The only move that makes sense is queen f6. However, in this case, white has a very strong move, knight e4, attacking the queen. And after f takes e, again the pawn disappears from f5. On f5 it was defending the knight, and now that the pawn is gone, white simply captures on g4, and the e4 pawn is weak, and it will fall, and white will be up a pawn, and white's position will be strategically won. That's why after knight h4, as f5 doesn't work, Geller plays a6. And Taimanov simply continues his development, bishop d2. Now the bishop is looking towards the queenside, and it can invade the queenside, and that might be very unpleasant. So, what to do? Black, of course, cannot play on the queenside, because white has the advantage on the queenside. The center is closed, so black must do something on the king side. Otherwise, white will simply open up the position on the queen side, invade the queen side, and crush black's position. That's why, as f5 doesn't work, the only possibility for the counterplay left for Geller is h5. Taimanov kicks out the knight, h3, and after knight f6, he continues his play on the queen side, b4. Geller played b6 in order to maintain the blockade on the queen side, and after b takes c, the b file is open, and Taimanov immediately takes it under control, rook b1. Geller plays knight d7, vacating the f6 square for the bishop, as you will see. Queen a4 followed, activating the queen. Now the queen takes under control the c6 square, and the invasion on c6 might be very unpleasant, attacking both the unguarded rook and the unguarded pawn on d6. Geller plays bishop f6, attacking the knight. So, now it's very interesting that both Bronstein in his book and Taimanov in his annotations write that queen c6 would be premature. At first sight, it's a strong move, attacking the rook and the pawn. However, they write that black has a strong move, rook a7. And in case white captures the pawn, black has a strong move, rook c7. And it turns out that the queen doesn't have any moves, any squares to retreat. The c6 square is under the rook's control, and the b6 square is under the knight's control. And black is threatening bishop e7, attacking the queen, and so the queen would be simply lost. However, both Bronstein and Taimanov missed a very strong move, knight b5, with tempo opening the bishop's diagonal. So black doesn't have time to attack the queen, because the knight together with the queen are attacking the rook, and after a takes b, white can play bishop a5, attacking the rook. The rook is pinned, and white will simply win the exchange. But of course, it was very difficult move to spot, I mean knight b5. That's why Taimanov simply plays knight f3. So Taimanov will win by purely positional means, as you will see. So Geller continues his counterplay on the queen side. However, h5, of course, and h4 which followed isn't effective at all because black simply doesn't have sufficient attacking resources on the king side. Black pieces are very passive and this counterplay on the king side isn't dangerous at all. Taimanov plays knight d1, opening his bishop's diagonal. Now queen c6 would be even more effective and even more dangerous. That's why after h takes g and h takes g, Geller played knight b8, taking under control the c6 square and preventing the invasion of the queen. However, now all black pieces, except the dark squared bishop, are placed on the 8th rank, and black's pieces are cramped, and black has only two ranks, the 7th and the 8th rank to maneuver, while white has 3 ranks. White has the space advantage, great space advantage, and white pieces have more freedom of maneuver, and white pieces are much more mobile, and Taimanov will exploit this with great effect. First, he plays rook e3. His idea is, of course, to double on the b file. Geller plays knight h7, and of course rook b3 followed. Now the rooks control the only open file, and white has created an immediate threat. The knight on b8 is under attack. That's why bishop d7, defending the knight and also attacking the queen. White played queen a5, and the exchange of the queens would simply lead to a hopeless endgame for black. So after queen takes a5, for example, white would play bishop takes a5, of course, and the bishop would invade c7, attacking black's main weakness on d6, and black simply wouldn't be able to defend it because white can attack the d6 for the second time with the rook, and the d6 would fall and black's position would collapse. That's why after queen a5, Geller avoids the exchange of the queens and plays queen c8, attacking the h3 pawn, and Taimanov plays knight f2, defending the pawn. And bishop d8 followed. So gradually Geller pushes white pieces back from the queen side, and queen c3 followed. Bishop a4, again attacking the rook. Seemingly active rook b7 doesn't make any sense because black would simply play rook e7, which would lead either to the exchange of a pair of rooks, which would ease white's tremendous pressure on the b file, or white would simply be forced to lose a tempo and retreat. That's why, of course, not instead of bishop b7, Taimanov simply played Instead of rook b7, Taimanov simply played rook b2. And now that the knight has finished its mission on b8, it protected the c6 square and prevented the queen from invading c6. Now Geller plays knight d7. So white has the total domination on the b file. However, now white cannot exploit this because rook b7 simply doesn't give anything to white. White rook wouldn't attack anything on b7. And all invasion squares, as you see on the queen side, a5, b6, are under black pieces' control. So white currently cannot make use of his advantage on the queen side. That's why, using his space advantage, and the space advantage lets Taimanov transfer his pieces from the queen side to the king side much quicker, much faster than black can do it. Taimanov starts the attack on the king side, and his idea is to distract the black pieces from the queen side. As you see, most black pieces are placed on the queen side, and when white starts the attack on the king side, this attack will be very effective, and black will be forced to transfer his pieces to the king side in order to defend the king side. And after that, the rooks will invade b7 with great effect. But how to start the attack on the king side? Now you can pause the video and try to find Taimanov's move which signals the start of a very strong attack on the king side. So the move is h4, taking under control the g5 square and vacating the h3 square for the bishop, and the bishop, which is currently very passive, it's limited by its own pawn on c4, will be a great piece, will turn into a great piece on h3, and on this diagonal, of course, it will be ideally placed. So Geller plays rook a7, trying to defend the 7th rank, the b7 square, and generally the 7th rank. Bishop h3, of course, followed, and the bishop is attacking both the knight, and the knight is pinned. The queen is also, the x-ray is very unpleasant. That's why Geller plays queen c7, moving away from the bishop's diagonal. And a strong move, knight g5. The knight is, of course, very active, so Geller exchanges his passive knight for the white knight, which is much stronger. But after the mass exchanges on g5, so we can see that on the one hand, of course, the side which has less space and the side whose pieces are cramped must always try to exchange the pieces, because in this case the lack of space loses its importance. But on the other hand, now after these mass exchanges, the pawn on g5 is very strong. It blockades the king side and it controls very important squares f6 and h6, and now the knight will get a great outposts on these squares, and that would be the invasion of the knight will be inevitable, and that will create deadly threats. So as the invasion of the knight after knight g4 is inevitable and it will come with check, Black plays king g7, so that the invasion of the knight at least comes without check. And another strong move by Taimanov. Now he moves his queen to the king side too. Queen f3, taking under control the f6 square and creating a deadly threat. David Bronstein in his book indicates a very sophisticated move. The threat is king g2. At first sight, it's not easy to see what is the threat. However, this quiet move would create a deadly threat, namely the exchange on d7. The knight, as you see, is defending the f6 square, but white is threatening to capture the knight, followed by queen f6 check, and after the king retreats, now we can see the idea behind king g2. The king opens the rook's way to h1, and from h1, the rook together with the queen will create deadly checkmating threats on h8. That's why Geller must play queen d8 in order to prevent white queen from invading the f6 square. However, the queen on c7 was controlling the b7 square, and now that the queen was forced to move closer to the king side, the queen side isn't defended anymore. The b7 square isn't defended, and Taimanov immediately exploits that. Rook b7, and the rook is very strong now, and it will create, as you will see, very dangerous threats on the 7th rank. So the exchange took place on b7, and now again white has created a very unpleasant threat, namely simply bishop takes d7. And after bishop takes d7, white will play queen f6 check and win the d6 pawn, after which black's position would collapse. And after queen f6 check, black cannot capture the queen, because first white will capture the queen with check, and then white will simply capture the bishop on d7, and white will be a piece up. So in order to prevent all this, Geller plays king g8, so that queen f6 comes without check. But now bishop takes d7 followed, and after bishop takes d7, the knight comes into play with great effect. Knight g4, creating deadly threats. Knight f6 check. Knight f6 check would simply be deadly. So the rook will fall, the bishop will fall. White, besides that, white is threatening to simply capture the bishop right away, and after queen captures, knight f6 check would be a fork and the queen would fall. Of course, black cannot capture the knight. Now you can see the power of the rook because of simply queen takes f7 check followed by checkmate. So the bishop must stay on d7 to close the rook's way. And rook e7 doesn't help either because of simple knight f6 check, and after king g7 again the queen h1 move, and white creates deadly threats on the h file. Queen f6 check would be actually checkmate, and black cannot prevent it by playing queen h8 because after the exchange of the queens, of course, the bishop will simply fall and white again will be a piece up. That's why after knight g4, Geller played queen takes g5, but of course his bishop falls now and white is simply a piece up. Geller played f5, but after e takes f, rook b8, without waiting for Taimanov's reply, Geller resigned. And now I recommend watching another brilliant game of Taimanov from the same tournament, in which he miraculously transformed his bad bishop into the best piece on the board. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.